please. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our town hall between bombs and blockades, tackling food insecurity in unstable times. Food security has become an important issue for the Munich Security Conference over the last few years for all the wrong reasons, but here we are, and we need to come to grips with what is happening in the world and of how to rethink the relationship between development, security, and international diplomacy. And to do that this afternoon here at our town hall, we have 4 participants. First and foremost, Cindy McCain, a good friend of the Munich Security Conference, I may say, and the executive director of the World Food Programme, which will introduce the thematic discussion to us this afternoon. She will do a stage setter, then she has to leave us because she's going on to better and greater things.
Oh, no.
But we appreciate, Cindy, that you made time. You have been a strong supporter of the work that we do here at the Munich Security Conference. We're very proud to report that we have a total of 8 food security events this year at Munich. I think we're going to put the foot on the brake a little bit, otherwise we're going to be unpopular within our own organization, so it's going to be too much. But it is also indicative of the fact that the conversations have really advanced over the last few years, that there is no clear-cut separation between the Cold War division and the silos of diplomacy, defense, and development, the 3 Ds, as we say in the United States. So, welcome once again. It's a pleasure to see you, and let me turn the floor over to you, Cindy.
Well, thank you, and I sincerely appreciate the invitation. You know, you raised the point about maybe too many events with food security. I will remind everyone, though, food security is national security, plain and simple. And we work by that at WFP. We live by that at WFP because food brings stability into regions, and it brings security into regions. So we go by the adage that food security is national security, if I may. I'm very happy to be here, and you know, I feel sometimes like I'm a bearer of bad news all the time, and I joke sometimes, but it's not a joke that I'm no fun at a dinner party because people usually want to run out when I show up. So, but I am very glad to be here and be a part of this conversation. Actually, simple truth is, wars fuel much of the hunger and malnutrition that we see in our world today. In 2024 alone, we had 120 armed conflicts in the world. It's the highest number since World War II. At the World Food Programme, we deal with the devastating impacts of this destruction every day. Sudan, it's ablaze right now. It's a brutal civil war, and famine has been confirmed on the ground in Sudan in 10 locations across that country. And yet we still can't get in at scale. It's very difficult, even in the regions that we're in. Most recently, and those of you who are up on this stuff, I know you know, but Zamzam camp was completely burned down. So we've not only lost the camp where they were staying, where the refugees were staying, but we've also lost many lives as a result of it. Gaza, acute hunger has engulfed the entire population. At one point, there was famine on the ground. 2 million people are affected by that right now. In just 2 short months after the conflict began, WFP estimates that today 343 million people are struggling with severe hunger, of which 70% live in conflict zones. When violence erupts, civilians are forced to flee for their lives, abandoning their lives and their livestock. Infrastructure and assets critical for supporting livelihoods are completely destroyed. Local food production systems and markets collapse. And all too often, access to food, and this means to produce food, is manipulated as an instrument of war. At the same time, humanitarian agencies face daunting challenges as we try to get life-saving aid to traumatized victims caught in the crosshairs. We've been forced to navigate an increasingly dangerous landscape marked by growing risks to aid workers, restrictions on access to people in need, and a general erosion of the principles enshrined in international humanitarian law. And I will say here, as I say everywhere I go, humanitarian aid workers are not targets, period. But some countries don't quite understand that, as you have seen lately. In 2024, 325 aid workers were killed, the deadliest year on record. This painful reality was highlighted for WFP on Tuesday this week, when one of our colleagues in northern Yemen died while he was in detention. Ahmed was one of the dozens of UN staff arbitrarily detained by the Houthi de facto authorities. It's an outrage that any humanitarian worker could be a target. Yet, despite the dangers, WFP teams are still working on the front lines, and I'm very proud of each and every one of them. They are an incredibly brave bunch of people. They're just remarkable, and I'm very proud to be able to call them my friends. We take all the steps possible that we can to reduce the risks, such as humanitarian notification systems, which inform all parties of humanitarian movements and sites. But sometimes they simply don't function. Ultimately, these mechanisms are no substitute for armed combatants respecting their obligations under international humanitarian law. There are three things global leaders can do to help break the vicious cycle of conflict and hunger that traps millions of people around the world. First, collaborate to find political solutions to end the conflicts raging in so many regions. Only effective humanitarian diplomacy can do this, and it requires political will and determination. Second, use your influence to ensure all parties respect the principle of humanitarian access so we can reach those in need of assistance wherever they are. Without access, we cannot get the help where it's needed the most, and the innocent victims are the ones that take the brunt. Third, it's vital to maintain support for UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which condemns the use of starvation as a method of war. Ladies and gentlemen, preventing the use of hunger as an instrument of war is not just a humanitarian obligation. It's a strategic imperative. Food security is the bedrock of each nation's national security. When a humanitarian crisis explodes, its shockwaves are often felt thousands of miles away. So supporting food security is a wise and effective investment in global stability and security. Now more than ever, the international community must devote its resources and attention required to create the conditions for effective humanitarian action in conflict zones. If we don't meet this moment, we'll be living with the consequences of failure for many, many years to come. I will also add, if I may, on a personal note that occurred today in DRC. We've been, as you know, Goma's been surrounded. We've had M23 running around. We have IDPs as well as refugees up and down and push back and forth. We can't get the food, and we can get the food, and it depends on what the day changes. Well, today they took another town, Bukavu, and the airport. So that's why these things that I'm telling you today, and that we've all talked about at great length together, are so important that we abide by and that we adhere to in each day that we work as humanitarian aid workers. Thank you.
Cindy McCain, thank you so much.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Thank you. I'm sorry I have to leave. I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. May I please ask our other guests to join me here? On stage would be the wrong word, but in these comfortable chairs. Vera, you are here. Niels.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let me thank you for joining to meet here today and to be part of the conversation. We have Vera Songwe, the chair of the Liquidity and Sustainability facility of the United Nations, member of the Munich Security Conference Food Security Task Force, and the foremost expert on issues that we're discussing here. We have Niels Annen, Deputy Secretary, or Parliamentary State Secretary, as the Germans would say, at the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Berlin. Thank you so much. Also a member of our task force. And we have Asmund Grover Aukrust here, who is the new Minister for International Development in the Kingdom of Norway. Yes. It's his first week on the job.
Yeah, it is.
So we are very grateful that you're here and that we could convince you to travel to Munich in the middle of winter and be part of this conversation.
Yeah. Every week will be like this.
Okay, let's not go there. But Asmund, Minister Aukrust, let me ask you the first question. Cindy McCain has pointed out that weaponization of food, which is actually outlawed by a UN Security Council resolution that is not really being implemented, is a key issue, not only for development, but also for stability and national security in entire regions. Talk a little bit about what different tools are being used to weaponize food, because it's a relatively new concept, and we know about the strategies of starvation, but how do you, as somebody that has a background in international policy and defense policy, look at the description that Cindy McCain just gave to us?
Well, I think she made a very good description of what this is about, and I'm very glad that you here on the Munich Security Conference have this as a very important theme and as a debate. Historically, development aid has not been very much about security issues. Today, we know that they are extremely closely linked, both because crisis, conflict, and wars create instability, and that affects all of us. What's happening in the Middle East affects us also here in Northern Europe. What's happening in Northern Africa do the same. And I think we all have a very good proof of this after the war in Ukraine, and how much this has affected both the security and stability in Europe, obviously, but also in Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East. So, I mean, I think it's very great that you have this as an important issue here. And we also see, unfortunately, that hunger, lack of food security, is used as a weapon. And I think the most important issue for us as politicians is to, first and foremost, prevent that this is happening. Use all kinds of tools that we have internationally, in diplomacy, use the international laws that we have. And when it happens, we should talk loud about it. Norway formed as a resolution to the UN General Assembly in December that asked the International Court of Justice to give an advisory opinion that clarified Israel's obligations to give food and health systems to the Palestinians living under occupation in Gaza and the West Bank. This was adopted with a huge majority in the UN Assembly, and I think this also sent out a very powerful message to all those people that are on the front line. And I mean, that's quite new. Historically, those that have been on the front line has been people in uniform. Today, we see that the people in the front line are many of the aid workers in Sudan, in Myanmar, Yemen, in Gaza, Ukraine, other places, and we see that they also have been a target. And I think Gaza and Sudan is maybe the worst examples that the world are facing right now. So I think that's, of course, the most important thing that we can do. The second one is to use those international mechanisms that we actually have to follow up the UN resolution. We should use the International Court of Justice. We should use, of course, the UN Charter. So that's my second point. And the third point is that we all need to step up. We need to increase our funding. We need to increase the resources that we are using for food security. And now there is an extreme differences in the need and what's actually been contributed with. So there I think we need to work together to form alliances between our countries, and also to get more private companies and private capital into this issue.
Just a very brief follow-up question, asking you for a very brief answer. Cindy McCain just said food security is national security. That's a very strong statement.
I totally agree.
You
totally
agree with that?
Totally agree.
Does that mean that you have to rethink the institutional division of labor in governments and maybe rethink the way we think about the nexus between development, food, and security?
In very many ways, I think we already have done that. We are talking about this in a different way now than we used to be. In Norway, we have just said we just formed a new government 1 week ago. And our new Minister of Finance does, of course, have the responsibility of what's happening within Norway. Jens Stoltenberg, he just came from NATO as the Secretary General. And in Norway, that was we are very excited about this because it's so linked what's happening abroad and what's happening within our own nation. So I think people see the linkage very much more than it used to be. And I think we also, as politicians, have taken steps in that direction, where we see security outside as an insecurity outside, also as an insecurity within.
Thank you for clarifying that. Deputy Minister Anand, let me move over to you. You travel the world in your current function in the German government, but you also bring a unique perspective to the development, the Economic Cooperation Development Ministry, because you have served as Deputy Secretary in the Foreign Office for the previous 4 years. Talk a little bit about the ripple effect of when food becomes weaponized. What are the consequences? How does the world look like, and what are the specific issues that we need to pay attention on?
Well, yeah. First of all, thank you and congratulations on your nomination. I think, first of all, roughly 90% of violent conflicts are happening and crises are happening in developing countries. So this is easy to be said, but what does it mean? It means that we have conflicts in regions that are already struggling. We had a town hall here, we talked about the climate impact on forced migration and displacement. I think the very fact that in most of the cases we have fragile governance, we have fragile constellations, not being able to guarantee access to food, which is, the basic precondition for human life, is making it impossible not only to serve the local population, but we are just few years away from the SDG target that the international community set. So no food access to food means no stable, healthy population, means increased conflict about the remaining food. It makes it easier for varying parties to impede access to food. And that is a very polite formulation. We see that in conflicts, that is being weaponized. And so I think we really need to understand that the erosion of international standards and international humanitarian law have grave consequences, because it's not only a human tragedy, it also has consequences of the very ability of governments and international organizations to govern entire regions. So if, we have elections in a week's time in Germany. In a campaign you discuss about all kinds of things. I think it's a very important, and it's not a partisan issue. I think it's very important to make clear to voters in developed countries that it's not about charity. If people are starving, it's increasing conflicts, it's forcing migration and refugee situations. It's affecting our own security, it's affecting our own prosperity. And that's why I'm so concerned that we see so much pressure on development and humanitarian budgets. That is one thing. But we see a really decrease of international standards. And that's why I also agree with Cindy McCain. This is a very symbol of what is happening right now, that humanitarian aid workers are being targeted because they're in the line and they're preventing warring parties from using hunger as a weapon. And that's why here in Munich, where we discuss hard security, it needs to be center stage.
Do you feel that you and can't ask you because you've been on the job for only a week, that you're being heard here by the military leaders and the people that focus on what we traditionally called hard security?
I do. I mean, obviously more needs to be done. We are here on a wonderful town hall, which my ministry is happy to sponsor. Maybe we move on the big stage one day. But I give you one example. The German Development Corporation has been working in the Sahel region since the 1960s. And I mean, this is really a region where we care about. It's our neighborhood. People are not aware of that. And I mean, I think it was the first time that the development minister and the defense minister, my boss Svenja Schulze and German defense minister Boris Pistorius, took the endeavor and made a joint visit to the Sahel region. I think, I mean, it's a symbol, but it shows that something is moving. And we're getting more and more also requests in form of providing information, our own, I would say, development intelligence. And that's a good thing. And that's why I have the impression, yeah, something is moving. But the question is, are we fast enough in that movement?
Thank you very much for clarifying that. Vera, Dr. Songwei, let me move over to you. You focused a lot on the nexus between climate change, trade, tariffs, and the economic dimensions of the food system, particularly in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as potential vulnerabilities and open flanks, so to speak, to the weaponization of the food system that we're trying to describe in a little bit of detail as we sit here?
No, thank you. Thanks to the MSC for having me here. I think if you listen to the last 2 days of conversation, we've talked, first of all, a lot about, of course, an ongoing war. But there are three things that are happening in the world today, which are sort of global shifts that affect, all of them affect food security, interestingly enough, which is why I think it's so important that we're having this conversation today. The first one, of course, is climate change. And the fact that with climate change, what we see is first crop yields that go down. We see rising food insecurity. Where there is food insecurity, there is conflict, and that eventually then leads to national security. The second one, of course, is nuclear weapons. So the whole sort of weaponization itself. But the whole conversation around what kinds of weapons are used, also, we're testing a lot of that in environments where already you have severe food security issues. And finally, IT. IT has two different options for us and where we go forward. One of them is we can improve substantially crop yields because of climate change. Crop yields are changing, access to food is changing, and so we could do a lot more with that. And when we go back in history, one of the sort of innovative points of the military has been finding out ways to deliver food to food insecure environments. Actually, a lot of the technology, a lot of the innovation, the packaging of food bars, all came from sort of how we deliver food to the military. And so the use, I think, of the military systems in delivering food is something that has been and could continue to be quite important. The struggle that we still have is how we move from looking at sort of food systems as humanitarian to looking at food systems as agriculture for trade, for economic security, because economic security leads to military security. And as long as, we only talk about food at the point when we need it for humanitarian security because there is already an ongoing war, I think that we're sort of catching the problem. If we were able to increase food production, increase crop yields, then my sense is that the 172 different points of conflict that Cindy talked about earlier will probably reduce. Because we've done a lot of work on the African continent which shows that when food production goes down, food insecurity goes up and conflict goes up even higher. And so if we can work that supply chain from the bottom up, which is to say, let's increase food production, provide people with prosperity, then, we don't have to sort of suffer the food humanitarian insecurity problem. I think it will be quite an important, but for that to happen, we need markets, to your question. We need to be able to open more markets. The good thing about technology and AI is that we can do the markets much easier. We can use logistics to deliver much faster. We can improve on pricing. I think a lot of the work that the German government has been doing is building markets.
Right.
And if we can do that, then I think we reduce the food security question. But now climate has added to it, and we must see how we work the climate space, because what we will end up having, I think the fear is, and this is part of the problem in the Sahel, today we have instability with Boko Haram and a lot of the other terrorist factions coming in because the river basin dried up. Mm-hmm. And what you ended up with is people moving into other agricultural lands to look for food, and that is creating conflicts in those societies, and we need to work on that.
Perfect. So I hear you. For me, there's two main takeaways. You argue that we should move from an aid-oriented perception into a more strategic environment, including maybe also the military does that on a regular basis, exercise foresight strategies in order to address the issues that you pointed out. And then I think the climate point is very well taken, because military conflicts are cyclical. They go up and eventually they end. Yeah. The linearity of the climate threat is that it's linear and it's going into the wrong direction, and it's not cyclical. It's unlikely to reverse, at least during our lifetime. So that's very interesting. Let me just connect to what you have just outlined, Vera, and ask Minister Åkrost, again, given your defense background, if we talk about food security in these strategic and geopolitical terms, we also have to kind of apply military strategies of deterrence and think of how we can stabilize food systems from a strategic standpoint. What could be instruments of deterrence, of securing in a strategic environment before crises happen, to stabilize agri-food systems, development strategies, and what outlook would we have to develop to be more successful instead of just reacting when the hunger catastrophe has already happened?
No, a very good question, and I think we need to work together to form alliances between the North and the South, and that's what I'm very afraid of now, is that many countries in the West, and of course especially after the freeze from the US, they are turning back with all those effects that has. Norway is now a guest country of G20. Mm-hmm. It was last year in Brazil, and we are now in South Africa. And this is one of our main issues, to link food security together with security in general. So I think we need to form coalitions between countries, between civil society, and also with private companies. And I think, there are so many proof that there are so clear link between this issue. Remember the Arab Spring in 2011. What was the start of the Arab Spring? It was the prices of wheat. And that was what happened when you had fire all around in the Middle East. Syria has since then had 13 years of civil war with millions of refugees, with hundreds of thousands of victims. And I don't think we have totally discussed enough that the reason that this could happen was the prices on wheat and the food insecurity. So, think what we could avoid. Yes. If the world had been in a better shape when it come to before 2011.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Anne, let me ask you to go a little deeper on what Secretary Åkrost, Minister Åkrost has just outlined. How do we envision new coalitions between development, humanitarian, possibly security or legal actors to address these issues, to counter weaponization of food, to get ahead of the game? Are there discussions, for example, in your ministry that are happening along those lines? And if so, what are the next steps that we should be thinking about also as we think about future events of this format at the Munich Security Conference?
Well, Michael, let me maybe begin with Russia's war against Ukraine. To our credit, I think it's fair to say German Development Cooperation has been prioritizing food issues over many, many years. So we have been roughly spending 2 billion on investing in sustainable solutions, working with our partners. And I think it's very important also to look at new alliances, but also to do the important work in providing sufficient resources in especially those areas that are affected by climate change the most. Working with traditional crops can be a solution, but also with new technologies. We need to have that discussion. But what happened when Russia attacked Ukraine? It had an immediate effect on food security, especially in Northern African countries who sometimes, in some cases, were very highly depending on Ukrainian food supply. So the theoretical discussion about weaponization, that was very real. And I think it made also very clear that that war has a global impact. However, the starting point still was Russia's war against Ukraine. And also before that war, we had great many crises. So, the German response, our ministry's response, was to launch an initiative, a global initiative for food security, but also taking into consideration that, yes, it's true, we look at our own neighborhood, but that is not sufficient. So I could make a long story here, but I will make a long story short. The initiative which we started, which also is providing access to vital information, which not every government actor and private sector actor has had available, with additional funding, is now been taken over, has been taken over by the Brazilian G20 presidency, which gives, I think, another perspective from the South and shows that although from different traditions, and of course Brazil was not as affected as Tunisia, for example, and has maybe also a different view on the conflict in some parts of the conflict in Ukraine, but that was something where we could unite. And I believe that's very important and also underlines that it's really becoming, I would say, even a geostrategical discussion. But we need to follow up on that. And I think it's a responsibility of our leaders to do that. We provided, I think, a base, and the discussion needs to go on.
Quick political question. Do you think that what seems to be the retreat of the United States from this era of international engagement, do you feel a heightened sense of urgency when you talk to your colleagues in Europe, in Asia, and other parts of the world?
Oh, yes. I mean, Cindy McCain's World Food Program, which she represented here, is, I mean, very much based on U.S. funding. And there's a lot of concern. And, WFP is a major partner for us, also in the Sahel, to come back to that. And also, very importantly, not only on the humanitarian field, but investing in new innovative agricultural techniques, for example, to deal with the fact which you mentioned, that there's less arable land available. But that needs funding. But I remain optimistic. I'm listening to voices also from U.S. colleagues in the U.S. Congress and Senate, especially from agricultural states within the United States, who have been providing most of the food which WFP is dispersing. So there's maybe also not a political, but maybe also an economic incentive to keep that relationship up and running. But U.S. engagement remains crucial, and that's why we're having the discussion here also with our American colleagues.
Thank you. Before I go to you, Minister Åkesson wanted to interview.
I just wanted to add to your very important point about the war in Ukraine, that to also be a bit positive here, the war in Ukraine has shown us also, when we put ourselves together, the international community, the UN, other countries, we also can succeed. The Grain for Ukraine program has been a big success, and that has shown that we can, also do progress also in wartime. The Grain for Ukraine program has shown that we also can fight food insecurity in the face of very bloodful conflicts. So I think it's also important to use that example that it's actually possible when we all come together from the UN, from the international society, and from the neighboring countries.
I think that point is well taken. Let's hope it doesn't require another military conflict to create that unity that you describe. Vera, are there some best practice examples, given your experience, of coordinated efforts that you have just asked for that get ahead of the curve in the sense of addressing issues before they come to a culmination point where it might be too late?
I think the most important best practice example, of course, is the use of the multilateral development system, and the fact that if one uses institutions like the World Bank and the IDA window in particular for low-income countries, that we can begin quickly to exchange knowledge on seed production, improved technology, like you said, food-resistant seeds, and I think one of the best examples was, and it's continued, 2008, the last food crisis, and where what we saw was the Global Agricultural Food Security Program, which has now continued with the one in Ukraine, that we have built on that and we've been able to bring resources together. But it's not enough to have just the multilateral development systems. You must also have the private sector. And to your point, I think one of the issues around Ukraine was that it was not just that, it was difficult to get grain out, but the insurance companies quadrupled the cost of food. And so, we went from sort of food on the battlefield going up to economic warfare for food, right? And so essentially, 75% of the cost of food was the cost of transportation and the insurance cost of the boats. And I think in those areas, we also need to be able to come together and work with maybe the Maritime Association to bring that down. So it's the public sector, it's the private sector, and then it's innovation. And if you're able to bring things like that together, CGIAR, working with foundations, of course, we have a number of really good and important foundations that are working on improving seed technology. But at the end of the day, it's three things. It's level the playing field on markets, trying to see whether we have global, international conditions for ensuring that prices are, I don't want to talk about the common agricultural policies and sort of phytosanitary access, because only until we are able to sort of create market access for production are we also going to increase the price, the availability and production of food for it to actually work well. And then once we have that, bringing together, I think, this constellation, because remember, one of the things that leads to some of this insecurity is that people withhold food. In many areas of conflict, food is used as a recruitment tool. Right, and so essentially that's how you recruit. People are hungry, and so you can give them cheaper food and recruit them. If we can actually produce more food, also and I talk about the Boko Haram area in Nigeria and the Mali belt and all, that's how recruitment is done, is essentially you give them food and then they join. But if we could actually increase production in those areas, I think that we will reduce some of the conflict areas. So.
Thank you, Vera. Let us use the remaining time to have a few quick interventions from the audience, as is customary at the Munich Security Conference. The first question goes to one of our young leaders. Ground rules, please let us know who you are. Direct your question to one person. You can't ask all three of them, because then we will run out of time, and be as brief and concise as you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My name is Utara Motu. I am a member of parliament from Namibia. I would ask two of any of the panelists to ask my question. The monopolization of global grain exports by few countries has made food security highly susceptible to geopolitical tensions, as seen with Russia's blockade on the Ukraine grain exports and the export restriction of major food production nations. Now, if you were to provide advice to nations in the global south, how would you advise us to rethink within the international community trade policies and food diplomacy to prevent food dependency from becoming a tool of coercion in global power struggles, and which would be the allies that we can approach?
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that would like to intervene or chime in? Please raise your hand, let me know. We have a microphone out here. Sir, please. Again, let us know who you are.
Yes, I'm Richard Wilcox, United Nations World Food Programme. And a question for Dr. Songwe and perhaps Niels as well. very much an important observation that aid, no matter how important we think it is only ever a small fraction of the overall food economy of a country, right? We never get, even in the most extreme cases, we're not above high single digits. All that 90% plus of the food economy is the local food economy. So anything that happens in terms of prices, in terms of trade finance, insurance going into the country, has a massive impact. Point one. Point two, also for you, to see if somebody else would agree with me on this or not. It's not a WFP issue. We don't do fodder, don't do animal feed. Animal feed is a big geostrategic issue, right? And if you think back to Ukraine deals, President Putin was always going about, it's not even for human consumption, it's animal stuff. No, never mind. That stuff is really important. There are 340 million pigs in China. If they don't get fed for 3 weeks, they have to be slaughtered. It's a huge issue.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me give the first question to Vera and the second question to Niels, and then I'll ask Minister Aukrust to have the last word at this town hall. Vera, over to you.
No, I think excellent question. It is true that in times of sort of active conflict, war, and then we see the food crisis. But honestly, there is a silent sort of food insecurity war going on. Today we're talking about, I think Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF would say that we have 1,700 trade bans around the world. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are around food. And so in some sense, that's a silent sort of food insecurity war that is going on very quietly, right? And those export bans and trade bans then lead to active insecurity. So it's very important for institutions like the WTO to be able to help elucidate that and for the conversation to move forward. So yes, fully agree that economic policy, leveling the playing field is the right thing. And then I think you're right. We also, and we were together, working a little bit on the Russian blockade on grain. We talk about food, but there is the whole livestock chain as well. And actually in a lot of the North Africa belt or the Sahel belt, it is also about cattle and agriculture further. So there's that confluence of the two that creates different kinds of problems that we also need to look at.
Thank you, Vera.
Well, thank you for the questions. I think the orientation on having working markets, that's very important. And we saw the interruption of supply chains and what happened. Again, Ukraine was a case in point. And so I do think the access to credit, for example, it's also something we need to work on. And of course, I mean, we will not be able and should not be our aim to solve the food crisis by taxpayers' money or development or humanitarian aid. That's not sustainable. Exactly. There can be situations where we need to do that, and WFP then is very effective in bringing that aid. But we see that maintaining that high level of operational also costs, especially in those times, is very difficult. So we need also to look at and work with banks, for example, because they're not always providing credits, especially in those regions which I talked about, I think, in the first intervention, which are driven by conflict. And one of our development banks is providing credit lines for Ukrainian farmers, because commercial banks have not been doing that, at least not to the extent necessary. And guess what? They're making money. So that does not need to be a contradiction. So I think that is very important. I just very briefly want to address the question of animals, which you mentioned. Maybe the connection is not obvious at the first glance, but I mean, during the COVID-19 pandemic and all the discussion about the origins of the COVID-19 and the coronavirus, which I don't want to get too much into detail, but what we really learned is that we cannot afford to cut funding in research and resources for animal health. And I think the idea of a One Health, bringing together all those actors, is very relevant for the question of food security as well. My impression is a little bit that it's almost disappeared from the agenda, because nobody wants to talk about that terrible experience anymore, but that's actually one of the concrete lessons we learned, and that's why we keep funding those instruments with our government.
Thank you. Minister Åkerst, what are your key takeaways from this conversation?
No, I think thank you very much for a great conversation, and I think I'm very glad that this is high on the agenda now. And I mean, there is a line from what's happened in Holodomor almost 100 years ago to what's happening now in Ukraine and in Sudan and in Gaza and Myanmar and so many other places in the world at the same time. We need to stop these brutal wars, but I think we also need to face that to fight food insecurity will demand a lot of us, because the biggest challenge for our time is the climate crisis. In Norway, we had a report about the climate crisis and what are the climate risks that Norway is facing. And the biggest risk we are facing is not more rain in Norway, even though that will harm us a lot. The biggest risk was failed states in other countries. Failed states in Africa would create international mess, millions of refugees, and what's happening with the climate crisis abroad will affect also us very in the highest north. So, I mean, we need to stop the climate changes and we need to adjust to those changes that are here already. So, and the challenge is that none country can do this alone. We only will manage if we do it all together, and we are so dependent on each other. And in the world today, with so lack of trust among the big countries, I mean, we have big challenges, but we are here because we want to solve them. I mean, every problem human has made, human also can solve, and therefore I think it's very important that you have this as a theme here today, and we need to continue the conversation and continue the work and really step up between countries, humanitarian actors, the UN system, and everyone else. So, yeah.
Thank you for that call for action. Perfect ending for the conversation. We'll check upon you once you're half a year or so in your new job, and hope we continue the conversation. Vera, Niels, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Thank you all for making time, and enjoy the rest of the conference to the degree you can, given the situation in the world. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. No, Norway versus this time.